Hello, this is again Dr. Jonathan Bentwich, and I'm recording another very important lecture for the general public, for the layman public, as well as for scientists. This is following the publication of God's Physics new book. This was published by iUniverse.com, and it's a new scientific paradigm for the new 21st century. Today's topic, this obviously follows the publication of over 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, keynote opening lectures in multiple international scientific and physics conferences. I just lectured the opening lecture, or the keynote lecture, for the Aerospace 2021 in Paris. And essentially today's topic is very important because following the last video or presentation about the new scientific revolution of God's physics, 21st century physics, today I'm going to speak about one of the ramifications of this new scientific paradigm and new scientific revolution that's taking place now in science and in theoretical physics. And so today's topic is the new God's physics negates the old material-causal Big Bang model of the universe. So before I delve into the intricacies of this very important topic, let me just mention the fact that as I've lectured in previous presentations on this platform and in international conferences, and as I've written in the book, and in again over 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles, three just coming up, special issues. Science is just at the now at the center, or in the midst of a scientific revolution, and there is a paradigmatic shift. There is a shift from the old material-causal paradigm of 20th century physics, basically underlying relativity theory for the macroscopic universe, and quantum mechanics for the microscopic universe. So we're transitioning now, science is transitioning now from the old material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics of the last century, of 20th century physics, to the new 21st century new paradigm of God's physics paradigm. And that's also an acausal computational or acausal computation paradigm, which I'll again just outline. But we have to realize that we're standing at a historic point, which is essentially the same, even though it's more advanced, but it's of the same nature of what happened, what transpired 100 years ago when Einstein, the great Albert Einstein, one of the two greatest geniuses the world has ever known, the great Albert Einstein has then 100 years ago in 1905 and then 1915 and 1919, where there was a validation, empirical validation of his new, back then new, general relativity theory. And that was a revolution in science. And we have to realize, as I've been speaking about time and again, and as Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher of science, pointed out, that science is not static, it's actually evolving, and it's getting closer and closer to the discovery of the real reality of this universe, and of ourselves, of course. So we're standing at a historic point where there is a transition, just like 100 years ago when Einstein made a big revolution, a paradigmatic shift, a scientific revolution from the old Newtonian mechanics to the new 20th century relativity theory, and then also quantum mechanics. In the same manner, right now, science, physics more specifically, but science more generally, is undergoing a major revolution, a major scientific paradigmatic shift from the old 20th century relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which I term the material-causal paradigm, which I'm going to explain again, to the new acausal computation paradigm of God's physics, new paradigm for this 21st century physics. So perhaps the best place to start is very briefly, because I've spoken about this also in previous presentations, but I always like to, the book has also been written to the general layman public and reader, and I always like to allow anybody who is watching this presentation to catch up without necessarily seeing all the previous presentations and lectures and so forth. So just to explain very briefly, the old material-causal paradigm is typified, is characterized by a basic assumption. And we're going to actually show today that this basic assumption has been undermined and has been negated by the new God's physics paradigm. And we're now opening a new era in scientific inquiry and thought, and for humanity more generally. We look at the universe in a completely different way. We have a new picture of the universe. But the old material-causal paradigm of 20th century relativity theory and quantum mechanics essentially assumed that everything in the universe operates by cause and effect. Imagine a big clock ticking, or a big machine operating. There's cause and effect between the different components of the clock or of the machine. And the old material-causal paradigm assumed that it's always cause and effect. So we elaborated previously. I'm just going to mention it again. The universe was assumed by the old material-causal paradigm to have been created by a Big Bang nuclear event. In other words, there was a lump of very condensed matter. Then there was a nuclear event occurring with this initial condensed lump of matter. And that nuclear event then created the suns, the galaxies, space, energy, mass, and time. That's a material causal assumption. The same thing, by the way, in the subatomic realm, in quantum mechanics, where the assumption is that the universe operates by cause and effect. So when we want to measure any subatomic particle, the assumption, the material causal assumption of the quantum mechanics is that we want to measure, let's say, a certain target element. That target element is assumed to possess or to be dispersed along a probability wave function. Then we shoot another subatomic probe element that impacts or interacts directly with that target element or target's probability wave function, and that then causes the collapse of this probability wave function into a singular complementary space, energy, time, mass value. It's again time. It's again cause and effect. The accelerated expansion of the universe. We know that the universe is expanding. In other words, the galaxies are drifting apart, and it's doing so at an accelerated rate. So if at a certain time it's accelerating with a certain unit x, then subsequently the rate of expansion would be higher than x, but the rate of expansion would be at a straight line, so to speak. So it's an accelerated rate of expansion. And the assumption, by the way, is that dark matter and dark energy are hypothetical concepts, and they're assumed now to push the universe and to cause, again, the acceleration of the universe. That's based, by the way, on Einstein's general relativity, Einstein's equations, which are also material causal, and they assume that certain massive objects such as the sun are curving space-time around them and bending, therefore, the traveling pathways of planets around them, and that curvature or curved space-time then determines the traveling pathways of various objects, planets, etc. But again, it's a cause and effect assumption where a massive object curves space-time. Space-time then determines or causes the traveling pathways of various planets, etc. So this is the old material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And we highlighted the fact that, and Thomas Kuhn also highlighted the fact, or analyzed this progression, this methodical leaps and bounds progression of science, where the old paradigm of, let's say, material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics is reaching its limit at a certain point, and that's when we call it, or that's how we determined or defined a paradigmatic crisis. That the old paradigm, in this case relativity theory and quantum mechanics as part of the material causal paradigm, seem to contradict each other. That's a sign of a paradigmatic crisis. Also, the old paradigm cannot explain where up to 95% of all the matter and the energy in the universe, where they exist, and they're therefore hypothesized, or these are hypothetical concepts that the way to explain the accelerated rate of the universe is by assuming that there exists 95% more mass and energy in the universe than really can be detected. And that's a problem, because when science reaches a point where it relies on 95% of mass and energy, dark matter, dark energy, which are hypothetical concepts, cannot be detected directly, that's been going on for the last 2 decades, that's a problem. So that's also a sign of a paradigmatic crisis. And essentially, Thomas Kuhn is teaching us that when we have this paradigmatic crisis, that is a foretelling sign of the paradigmatic shift, or the next scientific revolution, which would expand the understanding, the old understanding, in this case of the old material-causal paradigm, into a broader understanding. And in one of the lectures, I gave the example, I think I also gave it in the book, of imagine a person, for example, being born in a room, and that room is closed, and the person grows up in that room. All their needs are taken care of in some way or some form or fashion. But in any event, they view the world, the reality for them is that confined room. They can't imagine anything outside the room, and they live within that room for a while, and that's fine. But then, for example, somebody knocks on the door, or maybe an object is sticking through the wall. So then they start suspecting that there's something broader outside the room, that the room is part of something bigger. And when they open the door eventually, they find out that the room is okay, the room exists, but it exists only as part and parcel of the house. And the house is part and parcel of the neighborhood, and of the county, and of the state, etc. So that's, in a sense, a metaphor for the expansion of our understanding, and where the old paradigm, in this case the old material-causal paradigm, is giving way, is expanding, because it's limited, because there is pragmatic crisis, as we said, about the contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and because the old material-causal paradigm cannot explain where those 95% of mass and energy exist, and it assumes there exists dark matter, dark energy, but that's, in a sense, not good enough. They cannot be detected for 2 decades. I mentioned in the last lecture that one of the last issues of Scientific American had a major article about the last stand of dark matter, dark energy, meaning that the scientific community is starting to realize that dark matter and dark energy are a problem, and that we cannot hold on to them for too long without them being verified empirically. On the other hand, that's what Thomas Kuhn has taught us, that's what Einstein has done remarkably well 100 years ago, that when we find a situation that the old paradigm crashes, there is a paradigmatic crisis, then we need to transition into, expand our understanding into a broader understanding, like the room being expanded into the house, into the neighborhood. So that expansion of the knowledge means or implies that the old paradigm becomes a special case within a broader newer paradigm. And essentially that's what's happening right now, and that's what happened with Einstein with his general relativity theory, in which the older 19th century Newtonian mechanics became a special case within the broader understanding of 20th century relativity theory, general relativity theory. And by the way, I mentioned that, but it's always remarkable for me to note that this great scientist, Albert Einstein, was also very modest. And in, by the way, Jewish tradition, it's not by chance. The great Moses was quoted in the Bible, in the Torah, as the humblest person ever. And that humbleness usually allows and is associated with the discovery of a great new understanding. So that applies in the Torah and in the Bible, and that applies today in science. And so Albert Einstein was a great scientist, one of the 2 greatest scientists and geniuses the world has ever known. And part and parcel of that was his humbleness. When he was asked about 100 years ago, what would you think, what would you envision would be the fate of your relativity theory, general relativity theory? Do you think it will hold forever? And in his humbleness, he said, no, I do not think it will hold forever. It wouldn't hold true for 100 years ago. That's what he was asked about. But I just hope that it will become a special case within a broader understanding. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Newtonian mechanics, which became a special case within the broader understanding of relativity theory. And that's essentially what's happening right now, where the old material-causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which seem to contradict each other and which cannot explain where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exist, that old paradigm is becoming now a special case in some form or fashion of the new acausal computation, God's physics paradigm. So I think we covered so far the understanding that the old material causal paradigm is crashing. It cannot exist in its current form, and it has to be expanded into the discovery of a broader, more comprehensive new paradigm for 21st century physics. And that's God's physics. It was called before the computational unified field theory, in great honor and respect for Einstein's visionary quest for such a unifying field theory. And so I called the theory initially the computational unified field theory in respect and in appreciation for his quest for the unifying field theory. Lately, over the last 2-3 years, it's been called now God's physics. It's the same essential model. And so the new God's physics paradigm now, we have to ask the question, or we have to explain, what's the big revolution from the old material causal paradigm into this new acausal computation, God's physics paradigm? And I'm going to try and make it very simple. Einstein once was has once remarked that truth has to be simple. It has to be so simple that it should be explained, or we should be able to explain it to a 3-year-old girl or boy. So I'll try to explain it in simple terms as much as I can. The great discovery of the new God's physics paradigm is that the way to resolve the contradiction between relativity theory about the macroscopic universe and quantum mechanics about the microscopic universe, the way to resolve this apparent basic theoretical inconsistency is by discovering a singular, higher ordered universal computational principle, or universal consciousness principle. And that universal computational / consciousness principle, or acronym UCP, that UCP is discovered and is postulated to compute simultaneously all exhaustive spatial pixels in the universe, the whole universe, every small spatial pixel in the universe, simultaneously. That's at an incredible rate of c² divided by Planck's constant, which gives us approximately 1.36 in the power of minus 50 per second, many trillions of times per second, that this UCP is computing and creating a universal frame. So at each trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth, etc., of a second, this UCP is creating a frame, a universal frame. The whole universe is created simultaneously as a frame, as a universal frame, obviously a 3-dimensional universal frame. And then after a very short period of time, a trillionth of a second, etc., it dissolves back into the UCP. Excuse me. So this major discovery of the new God's physics acausal computation paradigm is that the universe is actually being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved continuously by this UCP. The universe is not a static reality. It exists for a very brief period of time. It dissolves back into the UCP, and then it's recreated. And that discovery of a singular higher ordered UCP, universal computational / consciousness principle, that discovery of the UCP completely alters our understanding of the universe. It leads, first of all, to our basic understanding of what I call the acausal computation paradigm, because imagine that we have now the universe is created simultaneously, the whole universe dissolved to the UCP, then created and then dissolved, and each time the frame, the universal frame, is created bigger. That's part of the explanation of this accelerated expansion of the universe, discarding dark matter and dark energy as superfluous, as non-existent, if they cannot be found if they cannot be detected or found after 2 decades, and for other theoretical reasons, they have to be discarded. So the new way of explaining the universe is that this UCP is creating the universe, dissolving it, recreating it in a larger frame, dissolving it, and then in a larger frame. That's the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. I will speak later, perhaps just allude to one of the critical predictions, which has already been validated or received initial empirical validation, which is unique to this new God's physics paradigm, and which negates, by the way, the old material-causal paradigm, including, in a sense, the dark matter energy, and including the material-causal assumption of the Big Bang model. So it's discarding, in a sense, the Big Bang model as such. So we said the breakthrough of, and so now I'm trying to explain why, or what do we mean by saying this new God's physics paradigm is a causal computational paradigm. So the idea is that since all the pixels in each frame are computed simultaneously, there cannot be any cause and effect between any of these frames. Again and again, I'm giving this metaphor. Maybe I'll find a better metaphor, but it's a good metaphor about this material causality, or acausal computation. If we had a glass of juice and we had a hammer, and we saw in a film that the hammer is hitting the glass juice, the glass filled with juice, and then it's breaking it and the juice is spilling over the table, we would think that there is a cause and effect, because that's how it seems. Einstein once remarked that common sense is only that which is common to the senses, and many of the scientific revolutions questioned some of our assumptions. So it's doing the same thing. It's saying, okay, let's look at each frame by frame progression of the film. Let's see if there's cause and effect. First frame, they appeared together, simultaneously with a distance. Second frame, simultaneously with a lesser distance. Third frame, maybe they're touching each other, but still they're presented simultaneously. Fourth frame, this glass would be shattered and the juice would be spilled. But in all, and again, it will be presented with the hammer, let's say, superimposed where it hit the glass. So in all the frames, we see that the glass filled with juice and the hammer are presented simultaneously. So therefore, at none of these frames you can say there is any cause and effect. They're presented simultaneously, so they cannot affect each other or cause. There cannot be a cause and effect relationship implying that one thing precedes the other. So there cannot be any cause and effect. Now, if we took in between the frames, we would see that both of these objects are dissolved in the cinematic film metaphor. They dissolve into the white light. So, and in the model itself, that means that both the glass jar and the hammer are dissolving back into the UCP. So there cannot be any cause and effect in between the frames. Everything is dissolving there back to the UCP. So therefore, to complete the metaphor, even though it seems there is a cause and effect, really there's no cause and effect. Why? Because we realize that this cause and effect appearance is only because it's due to the fact that the producer of the film presented the frames in such a way that it gives us the impression that there's cause and effect. But really there cannot be any cause and effect, because in each of these frames, the glass jar or the glass cup and the hammer are presented simultaneously. There cannot be any cause and effect. And in between them, the frames, everything is dissolving back to the UCP, so there cannot be any cause and effect. So that's, in a sense, now, first of all, it's a major evolution in our understanding. The old paradigm is saying everything is causality, material causality. The universe was created by a Big Bang. It's expanding at an accelerated rate because of dark matter, dark energy, which cannot be found. They're purely hypothetical. But nevertheless, the assumption is as if dark matter and dark energy, if they could be found, they're propelling the galaxies. There's a cause and effect. And in quantum mechanics, as I alluded earlier, there's a cause and effect between the probability wave function, which is impacted by the subatomic probe element, which then causes the collapse of the probability wave function, of the target's probability wave function. And that's again cause and effect, and that again cannot take place, because if the UCP indeed is computing everything at the same time, there cannot be any cause and effect. So we enter a new era actually in science. And this new era essentially tells us that the universe is not a static phenomena. It's being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved. And it's being created in an acausal computational manner. In other words, the UCP is creating a series of frames. There's no cause and effect either between the frames or within the frames, but there is, in a sense, the producer, the UCP, that's creating the series of frames, changing them, expanding them, and leading them, actually, as we're going to talk about briefly, leading them with a certain purpose, with an ultimate goal in mind for this UCP. The UCP has created the universe and is creating continuously the universe towards a perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state, which we call Geulah, based on a Jewish term, Hasidic term, but still it's a state of perfection, moral, spiritual, and physical. So I think the first step in our journey here is to understand that the old material-causal paradigm is crashing. There is a transition towards a new acausal computation, God's physics paradigm, and that's based on the discovery of this singular, higher-ordered, universal computational / consciousness principle, which creates the universe, dissolves it, recreates it, and evolves it. And it's doing it by arranging a series of frames, and really there's no cause and effect, either within the frames, any frame, or between the frames. So that's quite astonishing. And then I think that would lend itself to our basic understanding why or in what manner this new God's physics paradigm could be negating the whole old paradigm's material-causal assumption, including the Big Bang model. Because if we understand that the UCP's simultaneous creation of every subsequent frame, universal frame, and for each frame it's creating everything simultaneously, that negates the very possibility of, let's say, a Big Bang a model, which assumes that the universe was created by cause and effect, by a nuclear event taking place associated with a lump of very condensed matter, and that's causing the creation of suns, galaxies, energy, mass, etc., space. So we start realizing that old paradigm cannot hold any longer. I'll explain where this is leading us scientifically and even for humanity. It's a very exciting transition. But I think the next step is just to explain briefly for the general public the fact that we are accepting now, science is accepting now more and more, accepting this transition to the new God's physics paradigm. And I just want to highlight the fact that, when I quoted earlier that Einstein said that he doesn't think his relativity theory will hold forever. And Einstein said that he was quoted saying he believes that within 100 years from the time that he was asked, general relativity theory will become a special case within a broader understanding. So we're at that point, actually. And in order for all of us to understand why science is now embracing more and more, is embracing this new God's physics, acausal computational paradigm as the new paradigm, replacing the new paradigm for 21st century, replacing the old material-causal paradigm, we have to understand that happens, essentially, that's what Thomas Kuhn taught us, and that's what Albert Einstein, the great scientist, demonstrated 100 years ago. So we have to understand how science is transitioning and why scientists and science more generally has to accept and is accepting this new God's physics paradigm, a causal computational paradigm, as a new paradigm for 21st century, which replaces and in a sense enlarges our understanding, replaces the old material causal paradigm of the Big Bang model and everything associated with that, of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and replaces them within and places them as special cases within this much broader understanding of the new acausal computational God's physics paradigm. So how does science embrace such a change? And by the way, it's not a secret that scientists are human beings, just as all of us. And that's what Thomas Kuhn, by the way, was in a sense freeing science and freeing our understanding where he said, well, for any human being, it would be hard when we perceive the reality as in one way, and then we have to change our frame of reference and discard the old way of looking at things, or maybe understand that it's a partial perspective to the reality, and then expanding our gaze. That's difficult for any human being, including scientists. And that's what Thomas Kuhn was telling us, that during that time, during those phases of a paradigmatic shift from the old material-causal paradigm to the new acausal computation God's physics paradigm, there is some reluctance, there is some fear, there is some difficulty for scientists to make that leap. But eventually, because science's sole mandate, in a sense, as a human endeavor, is to discover truth, to get closer and closer to understanding the real reality of the universe, the real reality of the everything around us, including ourselves. So it's received a mandate to investigating truth, and in very specific manners of objective studies and experimentation and logic, etc. So in order for science and scientists to make that leap now, which is happening between the old material-causal paradigm to the new God's physics acausal paradigm, the way to do that, Thomas Kuhn taught us, is by essentially identifying specific critical predictions which are unique to the new paradigm. In the case of relativity theory, I quoted that, it's a very famous historic example. In the case of relativity theory, when scientists were asked to embrace Einstein's new relativity theory, they were willing to do so because Einstein supplied a critical prediction, a unique critical prediction, where his theory, general theory of relativity prediction, would be different than Newtonian mechanics corresponding prediction. And as I stated, that related to general relativity theory's prediction that Mercury's perihelion pathway curvature around the sun would be double valued relative to Newtonian mechanics predicted perihelion traveling pathway around the sun. And that was due again to the hypothesized curvature of space-time by massive objects such as the sun. And so what we're seeing is that in order for science to transition from an older paradigm, which reaches a paradigmatic crisis and has to be expanded, into a newer paradigm, which is much more expansive, the way to do so is by identifying at least one or two critical predictions according to which the new paradigm can be validated. In the case of Einstein, when Eddington, the famous British astronomer, tested during the 1919 solar eclipse, tested Einstein's prediction relative to Newtonian prediction about the value of Mercury's perihelion pathway curvature around the sun. And when he found out that Einstein's prediction of 1.6 arc were more valid, or were the case, and not Newtonian's 0.8 value, then overnight scientists had to accept Einstein's new relativity theory. And very fortunately and gladly, in a sense, we're now reaching the same point. So I've written about this, I'm lecturing about this, including in the just recent Aerospace 2021, that we actually have such an empirical validation of the new God's physics paradigm for a critical prediction, two critical predictions of the new God's physics paradigm that are unique to this new paradigm. One of them has to do with actually the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, and essentially the difference, the two major differences between the new God's physics paradigm's critical prediction about a non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe, as opposed to the continuous accelerated expansion of the universe according to the old material-causal paradigm. So according to the old material-causal paradigm, since we have the hypothesized, completely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, they're pushing the universe, and they're pushing the universe to expand, and that acceleration rate hypothetically is supposed to be continuous. So it's supposed to be a certain line, a certain accelerated rate of expansion which remains constant. The new God's physics paradigm actually says that because, remember we said that the reason that the universe is expanding is not because dark matter, dark energy, which doesn't exist. The reason for the universe's expansion is because the UCP is computing each time a frame, universal frame of the universe simultaneously, then it's dissolving it, and then it's creating the next consecutive universal frame is already expanded. It's more expanded, more expansive than the previous frame, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, the critical prediction of the new God's physics causal computational paradigm is that the universe would expand at a non-continuous accelerated rate, and especially due to what I call the collective human consciousness focus, since the universal consciousness reality is the sole driving force behind the universe, and as we'll see in a second, is also the sole reality behind the universe, the true reality behind the universe. So the collective human consciousness focus postulate of God's physics new paradigm, new 21st century paradigm, is saying that during specific or special times, which I call the collective human consciousness focus special time, like in the Jewish Rosh Hashanah 2 days interval in which millions of Jews are focusing on this universal computational or consciousness principle or reality, i.e. God in religious terms. And so during those 2 days of collective human consciousness focus of millions of individuals, millions of Jews on this universal conscious reality, the new God's physics paradigm is telling us that then leads the UCP or the UCR, the universal conscious reality, to make a leap, to increase in a non-continuous manner the rate of the universe's expansion. And actually the prediction therefore is that for a non-continuous accelerated rate of the universe's expansion at the Jewish Rosh Hashanah collective human consciousness focus, which is again an instant in which we have this collective human consciousness, and therefore the prediction is that during this year, for example, it was on the 7th and 8th of September 2021. So I called cosmologists, astronomers to make this measurement. I'm still waiting for answers and communication, direct communication from scientists about this unique and very important critical prediction. But in any event, the critical prediction is that when we measure the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, let's say before 7th and 8th of this last September, and during the 7th, 8th, and after that, we would find, the critical prediction is that we would find a non-significant leap increase in the rate of the universe's expansion rate, beginning from 7th and 8th, where we have this collective human consciousness focus during the 2 days of the Jewish Rosh Hashanah time interval. And then that would carry through the whole next year, the next Jewish year. So I'm mentioning this because now we connect that. I just pointed out that the reason that science and scientists invariably have to accept and are accepting increasingly this new God's physics paradigm as the new satisfactory scientific paradigm for 21st century, replacing and expanding our understanding of the old relativity theory and quantum mechanics Material-Causal model. The reason for that is that when we find a critical prediction that is unique to the new paradigm and cannot be explained or is different than the predictions of the old paradigm, just as in Newtonian mechanics there was a prediction about 0.8 for the Mercury's perihelion pathway curvature, and Einstein's general relativity was 1.6. Once Einstein's 1.6 perihelion pathway value of Mercury's curvature around the sun was verified, obviously everybody had to accept that this is more valid, and that's what's happening here, because that prediction of the new God's physics paradigm, one of the critical predictions, describing a non-continuous leap in the rate of the universe's expansion, this has been verified. First of all, it's been verified through what I call the astronomical, cosmological universe's expansion rate Enigma. Essentially, scientists have found that when we look at the older assumed rate of the universe's expansion of the background radiation, we find a certain value, and then a smaller value than what's being measured now astronomically, a certain time after that, there's a gap. So there's a gap between the initial background radiation measured rate of the universe's expansion and today's astronomical measurement of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which is much higher. So that's a gap, and that indicates a non-continuous increase in the universe's accelerated rate of expansion. It doesn't remain constant. That supports the new God's physics prediction, and the subsequent half, or the remainder part of that critical prediction, unique critical prediction of God's physics paradigm, is to measure, as I've called scientists to do, astronomers, cosmologists, to measure that in fact every year, every Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year, 2 days time interval, there is that increase in the universe's accelerated rate of expansion. So that's the first indication, in a sense, that the universe is expanding, and that in a sense the critical prediction of God's physics, the universe is expanding at an accelerated non-continuous rate, and that negates the old material-causal assumption of relativity theory, where the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion should remain constant without leaps and bounds, and for sure not associated with, let's say, collective human consciousness focused time intervals such as the Jewish Rosh Hashanah. So we're getting now initial validation, actually, of the God's physics unique prediction. And another prediction, which is also received initial empirical validation, is regarding the proton radius puzzle. And the proton radius puzzle is essentially, without going into too many details, the proton radius puzzle is essentially telling us there's a phenomenon that when we take a hydrogen atom comprised of a nucleus in which the proton and the neutron are embedded, and when we look at that proton radius of a hydrogen atom, which in a standard case the regular hydrogen atom is encircled by an electron, negatively charged electron, we compare that to the proton radius of a hydrogen atom in which the electron was replaced by a much heavier muon negatively charged particle. And we find out that when there is the muon encircling the nucleus and the proton and affecting the proton and the nucleus, we find that the size or the diameter, the proton radius puzzle, the radius of the proton has shrinked significantly relative to the standard hydrogen atom, in which we have the electrons circling the proton, and where there the radius of the proton would be larger, and that's unexplained. Therefore, it's called the proton radius puzzle. Different explanations were supplied, but they're not resolving this problem. So essentially, that's another case in which and God's physics prediction, critical prediction, in fact, is precisely compatible or predicts those findings, because according to the new God's physics paradigm, the UCP computes the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass, and it's computing them simultaneously for every exhaustive spatial pixel in the universe, and so for each exhaustive spatial pixel, it's computing the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass. And the way that it's computing it, remarkably, there is a very new conception of how the mass, energy, space, and time values of every spatial pixel and of the whole universe, how that is computed, how that is created. And essentially, without getting into too many details, the new God's physics paradigm, remember we spoke about this singular universal computational or / consciousness principle, UCP, that's computing simultaneously all the exhaustive spatial pixels. Well, lo and behold, the way that this UCP is computing and in fact continuously creating, dissolving, recreating, and evolving every spatial pixel in the universe, is that the UCP possesses a few computational dimensions. So some of these computational dimensions are the three computational dimensions. The two relevant for us are framework and consistency. And essentially they're saying that framework and consistency, each one of them contain two levels. Framework contains frame and object. Consistency contain consistent or inconsistent. So these two computational dimensions of the UCP, the framework comprising of frame and object, and the consistency computational dimension comprising of consistent and inconsistent, these are creating four possible combinations. For example, the object consistent computational universal computational measurement would be of object consistent would be of mass. Object inconsistent measures or computations would be of time. So and vice versa, or complementary. Frame consistent UCP's computation would be space, and frame inconsistent computational output of the UCP would be energy. So we find that object consistent and inconsistent UCP's computation is mass and time. Frame consistent and inconsistent UCP's computational measures would be of space consistent, energy inconsistent. And so that's a whole new way of looking at the universe. And by the way, at the heart of this new God's physics profound model of the universe or understanding, it's depicted at the bottom of this book, this wonderful book. There's what I call the universal computational formula. And that universal computational formula completely integrates those four basic physical features for the first time in physics: space, energy, time, and mass. They're completely meshed and integrated as different byproducts, computational byproducts of the singular higher ordered universal computational principle, or universal consciousness principle, the UCP. I'm mentioning this because the prediction according to the new God's physics paradigm is that the UCP computes mass, as we said, as object consistent computational measures for each spatial pixel. That, in sense, predicts or implies and predicts that for more massive particles or objects, that comes about, that is computed by the UCP based on more frames in which this massive particle would be presented, and would be presented in a spatially consistent manner. So the more condensed, the more spatially consistent, the more massive a particle is, that arises, that is associated with more spatially consistent computations of the UCP for that particle. And so that meant that according to the UCP, according to the God's physics new critical prediction, it completely replicates or predicts the proton radius puzzle findings, because the more massive muon proton, or the more massive the hydrogen atom encircled by the more massive muon affects the proton, and due to its higher mass, it creates or is computed, the proton radius is computed as more spatially consistent, meaning that exactly the results that were found, that the proton radius of the muon hydrogen would be much smaller than the proton radius of the standard hydrogen atom, in which the less massive electron is encircling the proton and the nucleus. So we find again another verification, direct verification of the God's physics unique critical prediction based on the proton radius puzzle, as opposed to the critical prediction of God's physics new paradigm, which has predicted and can explain very, very beautifully the smaller radius of the hydrogen proton as affected by the muon particle, which is heavier and is causing that more spatially consistent measurement or smaller measurement of the proton radius in the case of the more massive muon hydrogen than of the electron hydrogen. And so what we're seeing is, what I'm saying is that we've reached a point now that we understand that the new universe, the God's physics paradigm, is now reached the point where it's accepted as the new paradigm for 21st century theoretical physics, the new paradigm for science, and that's based on the empirical verification or validation of two of the critical predictions of God's physics new paradigm. So we stand at a historic time. It's essentially the same. It's equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's 1919 solar eclipse. I'm of course calling again and communicating in fact with scientists and physicists, leading physics universities. I'm calling also in this presentation to experimental physicists and cosmologists and astronomers, some verifications, some additional verifications. I've called and I'm calling experimental physicists in subatomic accelerators to carry out those additional verification of the critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm. And I'm also calling the leading universities to communicate with me directly about further enhancement and further carrying out of this very important research. My personal email, it appears in all of the articles, is Dr. Bentwich, DRBENTWICH @gmail.com. So I could be reached and communicated via that email regarding that validation and further scientific collaboration, etc. So we're now understanding that God's physics is a new paradigm for 21st century physics and science more generally. And now I think we're ready to start understanding this profound shift and the negation, in a sense, of the old material-causal paradigm, which one of the most glaring examples or manifestations of that old material-causal paradigm is the Big Bang model. And so I'm going to explain, highlight again how this new God's physics paradigm is negating the old material-causal Big Bang model, alongside with all that comes with this in terms of general relativity's Einstein's equations, in terms of the collapse of the probability wave function, in terms of the discarding of dark matter, dark energy. And then I'm going to explain again this new picture of the universe, which is very profound and very exciting both for us scientists and to the layman and to humanity more generally. So why does this new, or how rather, does this new God's physics paradigm negate the old material-causal Big Bang model? We have assumed, or science, the old relativity theory Big Bang model assumed that the universe was created by this nuclear event. So imagine now, in terms of the new God's physics paradigm, that we had the first frame of the universe, in which we had a lump of matter, condensed matter. Perhaps in the second frame we have a nuclear event that is now taking place associated with this lump of matter, and then in the third frame we have an initial creation of mass, energy, perhaps stars. Obviously it may take more frames, obviously, but I'm just simplifying it. The point of the matter is that according to this new validated, empirically validated new paradigm of God's physics causal computation, even if we had such a progression of frames in which we had an initial lump of energy, matter, then a nuclear event, then the creation of suns, galaxies, it wouldn't hold in the manner in which the old Big Bang model assumes. The Big Bang model material-causal assumption is that we are creating, or that the initial nuclear event with this condensed lump of matter has created and has caused the creation of, let's say, suns and galaxies and matter and energy. But that is negated because in the first frame, the lump of condensed matter and, let's say, the nuclear event, they're presented simultaneously. They cannot interact in the first frame. They cannot carry over to the second frame because the whole universe is dissolved back into this universal computational consciousness principle. So there cannot be really any cause and effect in terms of a nuclear event taking place in the first frame, nor in the second frame, nor can there be any transference of any energy, any expansion, any creation of suns, galaxies, and their expansion in any of these frames. In the second frame, if there was a nuclear event, it cannot then interact and create suns and galaxies, because the suns and galaxies and the nuclear event in the second frame are presented simultaneously. Just as what we've shown with this simple glass jar and hammer example, if they're presented simultaneously, there cannot be any cause and effect between them. So it's not in the first frame, it's not in the second frame, it's not in the nth frame. Any number of frame, there cannot be any cause and effect. There cannot be any transference of any effect between, let's say, the assumed nuclear event in the first frame, then the propulsion and the expansion of the universe in the second frame. Because everything, all the spatial pixels, exhausted spatial pixels, are dissolving back into this universal consciousness slash computational principle, UCP. So there cannot be any cause and effect. So therefore the Big Bang model is negated, in the sense that there cannot be any transference, any cause and effect in any of these frames. There could be potentially an organization of frames, just like in the metaphor that I gave. There could be an organization of the frames, the universal frames, such a manner that we may perceive it as expanding, etc. But it's not because of any material-causal effect or interaction. There is no material-causal physical interaction, direct or indirect, in the first frame, second frame, etc. So we're negating now the God's physics new causal computation paradigm is negating the old material Big Bang model, and the same way, by the way, it's negating the material causal assumption of Einstein's equations. Einstein's equations are marvelous, but what they're essentially saying, there's a material causal assumption embedded within them, intrinsic to them, which is essentially saying, okay, we have let's say a massive object such as the sun, or a larger star, and that massive object then is causing the wrapping, the curvature of space-time around that. So first we have this massive object, and then there is a curvature of the space-time around it. That curvature, curved space-time, then is cause and effect, is assumed to now determine the traveling of this object and other objects around it. So it's like a progression of cause and effect, succession of events or interactions. But again, think about the basic God's physics paradigm, which has been validated now empirically. So in the first frame, second frame, we could have the sun or the massive object presented simultaneously with space-time, whether it's curved or not curved, but there cannot be any physical interaction between them. They're presented simultaneously. There cannot be any effect transferred. We cannot say that the sun has curved space-time, and that curvature of space-time, let's say in the first frame, now is causing other objects to curve in a certain way, to cause their traveling pathways, because there's no transference between one frame and another frame, etc. There could be, again, the director, quote-unquote, the UCP, is creating those series of frames, and it's arranging them in such a manner that, let's say, the universe is being shown to expand, or space-time, or some traveling pathways to exist, but it's not because of any cause and effect. The same. So therefore, by the way, dark matter, dark energy, on theoretical basis, is negated. We've shown earlier that dark matter, dark energy are negated or are seriously questioned by scientists. And in fact, I've called for the discarding of dark matter, dark energy. First, because they could not be found now for 20 years. But beyond that, even theoretically, that's what I'm saying now, what I'm alluding to now. Even theoretically, dark matter, dark energy cannot exist as a material causal assumption. If we had dark matter and dark energy, which I strongly doubt, if we had dark matter, dark energy, that dark matter, dark energy could not propel the universe, because it's being presented at each frame with the galactic elements, with the stars and galaxies and space-time, etc. So there cannot be any cause and effect. There cannot be any transference of any effect from one frame to another, because the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. And that's the gist, in a sense, of the new causal computational paradigm, which is essentially telling us we have to get rid of that illusion, in a sense, that illusion, that appearance that there is material causality. There's no cause and effect either within a frame or between frames. And we have to start looking up, in a sense, to this higher ordered singular universal computational / consciousness principle. We have to understand that the central actor, the key director, in a sense, of this evolution, creation, dissolution, recreation, evolution of the universe is not anything material causal. It's actually this UCP which is creating the universe and evolving it. So we now understand that the old Big Bang material causal paradigm, including Einstein's equations, including the collapse of the probability wave function in quantum mechanics, including dark matter, dark energy, including the initially assumed Big Bang nuclear event, all of those have to be discarded. And we have to metamorphosize science, and that's what's happening now, towards a new higher ordered understanding that we have acausal computation. There is a singular reality of the UCP that's creating the universe, dissolving it, recreating it, and evolving it. And everything about the universe, the creation of the universe, the origination of it, which is continuously being created, it's not being created such a period of time in the past. It's being created, recreated, and evolved at every trillionth of a second. And that's again a negation of the Big Bang model, assuming that the universe was created by an initial nuclear event and then continuously existing continuously and moving forward, propelled by the curvature of space-time, by Einstein's equations. But that's not the case. The universe is dissolving at every trillionth of a second. So the universe is really being created again and again anew every trillionth of a second by this UCP. I think the next phase for our understanding, and this would lead us also to the new picture of the universe, the new phase in our understanding is, and I mentioned that in the previous presentations, but I'm highlighting it. So if we understand that the universe is not static, it's being dissolved, it's being created, it's being recreated all the time. It's not being pushed or being caused by any material causal interactions. It's totally dependent on this singular higher order universal computational / consciousness principle. So the next step now, it's a little bit obviously new to our minds, and it's a little bit dissettling at the beginning, but we have to, science is about the inquiry of truth, discovery of truth, and we have to evolve, we have to expand our gaze. You can imagine that the person that was born in a confined room, would not be that happy when their perception was that the whole world is just their confined room, and then they hear bangs on the door. It's a little bit dissettling. They're saying, what's going on? I've known that my room is the only reality. Now I have to open the room, and I'm maybe a little bit apprehensive what is outside my room. But that's the nature of human knowledge and science and scientific advancement, and we have to advance. So in order to make that leap into the new God's physics paradigm, and by the way, I always like to point out that this new God's physics causal computation paradigm is actually extremely exciting. We live in a challenging time now with the pandemic and a lot of changes. We live in a challenging time, and this new God's physics model of the universe is very hopeful. Actually, it's leading humanity towards a perfected Geulah state, a perfected moral, spiritual, and physical state, and it gives us much more, in a sense, value and purpose and fulfillment about the universe's direction, about it being guided with moral principle, with fulfillment of a perfected moral, spiritual, and physical state. So it's not negative in a sense. The God's physics new paradigm, a causal computational paradigm, yes, it does expand our understanding of the universe. It may be a little bit dissettling at the beginning, as anything new in our life. But still, first of all, science is about the pursuit of truth and the realization of truth. That's what we do as scientists. That's where humanity is headed always. And you cannot stop truth. You cannot confine it. But so let's take the next step and understand that the next step in our understanding of this expansion of knowledge, expansion of the universe, expansion of our understanding of the universe, not as a static phenomena, not based on the Big Bang model, Material-Causal model, but as an acausal computational paradigm of God's physics new paradigm, So in order for us to realize and understand this beautiful and exciting and hopeful new paradigm, broader, more expansive paradigm, in order for us to do that, the next step is to speak about those two profound theoretical postulates which open the door for our new understanding. Those two profound theoretical postulates, I call them the computational invariance principle and the universal consciousness reality. And very briefly, what they are telling us is that since the only thing that is constant in our universe, which is being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved, the only thing that is constant is this UCP, this universal consciousness or a computational principle. Universal consciousness principle is the only thing that's solid, that's constant, that's continuous, that's uniform, because it exists both when it's creating the frame, the universal frames, and it's computing, remember, every exhausted spatial pixel in the universe simultaneously, and at the same, so it exists during the frames when it's creating and computing and really creating every point in the universe, and it's also existing in between the frames solely, singularly, without the physical universe. As compare that to the physical universe, which exists only transiently, phenomenally. It seems to exist, but exists only transiently for a very short period of time, and then it dissolves into the UCP. So when we compare these two, the physical universe, which exists only transiently and phenomenally, and as opposed to the UCP, or universal consciousness reality, that exists both during the frames and in between the frames, there's a large contrast, and we actually realize through these two postulates that we only have one reality, one constant element, which is this universal consciousness reality. That's the only thing that remains constant. So therefore, that's the only thing that's real. And in a sense, the universal consciousness reality is telling us that the physical universe, lo and behold, we start appreciating that it exists only as a manifestation, as a transient phenomenal manifestation of this universal consciousness reality. So we are opening our eyes and starting to realize that the universe is not a material entity. It was not created by a Big Bang initial nuclear event. It's not being expanded by non-existent dark matter, dark energy. It's not being evolved by Einstein's material-causal equations. It's a manifestation. It's a transient phenomenal manifestation of this universal conscious reality. The only real reality is this universal conscious reality, and the manifestation of the physical universe is only a manifestation of that universal conscious reality. Now, why is this important? And again, I can't explain everything in one presentation, but I'll go a little bit further just to expand our minds and understand where this theory and where this new understanding, exciting understanding of science is leading humanity. So once we realize that the real reality, the singular soul reality, is this universal conscious reality, which is creating transiently, phenomenally a universe, creating, dissolving it, recreating it, evolving it, that leads us to now looking at, lifting our gaze, so to speak, to this universal consciousness reality, or God in religious terms. It's the same. So we're starting to look at this universal conscious reality and saying, okay, if we want to understand the dynamics of the universe, the purpose of the universe, and the evolution, by the way, from inanimate matter, animate plants, animals, human beings, and then towards this perfected Geulah state of humanity and of the world, that gives us a certain understanding of the real nature of the universe. The universe, we said, is not material. It was not created by Big Bang, initial Big Bang nuclear event. It's not being evolved just randomly by cause and effect between massive objects and the curvature of space-time. No, we start looking at the whole creation of the universe and its progression towards the perfected Geulah state as, in a sense, pre-planned and orchestrated and driven by this universal consciousness reality. And this universal conscious reality essentially has a plan to evolve the universe from its initial rudimentary inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and then humanity and science towards that perfected Geulah state. That perfected Geulah state is characterized by a recognition of the oneness and the inseparability of everything from this universal conscious reality. And it's also now science is starting to recognize, I'll speak about it in another presentation, God willing, but science is starting to recognize that this universal consciousness principle, reality, there's the 10 hierarchical computational dimensions, universal computational formula. So that's an expansion of the universal consciousness formula to include the plan and the progression of the universe based on this plan of the universal conscious reality or universal consciousness principle, from inanimate to inanimate matter, animate plants, human beings, animals, human beings, and then humanity reaching that perfected Geulah state. And so maybe just the last few minutes of this presentation, I want to speak about, in a sense, where this is putting humanity. And I'll just mention the fact that this perfected Geulah state is a state in which the basic characteristics of this universal consciousness reality are being discovered and realized and, in a sense, lived by. This universal conscious reality is typified by all goodness, by oneness, by morality principle. Maybe I'll talk about this for a minute. This new God's physics paradigm essentially says that because this universal conscious reality is characterized by oneness, morality, peace, and ultimate goal of the perfected Geulah state, because of these characteristics, and the morality principle is a key element. So the morality principle essentially says that since this universal conscious reality is all oneness and it's all goodness, it strives to balance morally all of humanity, and in fact the whole world. So whenever any human being conducts or chooses an immoral choice towards another human being, God forbid inflicts pain or suffering of some sort upon another human being, that immoral action would lead, according to the dynamic equilibrium moral principle of this universal conscious reality, it would lead the universal conscious reality to select one of multiple possible futures for that individual human being that would balance and teach, in a sense, or correct the immoral action, because it's an intrinsic aspect of this universal consciousness reality. And so we find that the universal consciousness reality moral principle is essentially driving humanity towards recognizing their oneness, our oneness with this universal conscious reality, and therefore, consequently, our inseparability from each other. It's driving humanity towards a perfected moral state in which all of human beings, all of us, would respect each other, would view each other in the same way. I've given a metaphor that any healthy human being, mentally healthy human being, would not take their right hand and inflict pain on their right or on their left hand, because that's the same human being, that's part of the same human being. So we wouldn't do that. And in a sense, the moral principle and the Geulah state towards the universal conscious reality is taking humanity and science, or science and humanity, is towards realizing our inseparability from each other, towards realizing our key central role. Human beings possess the most expansive form of consciousness. And the whole goal, the ultimate goal of the universal conscious reality for the creation and evolution and driving the universe towards that perfected Geulah state is to reach a state in which humanity, specifically, and the whole world, realizes, recognizes, appreciates, and conforms or lives by this new understanding that there's only one reality, that's universal conscious reality. It's all goodness, it's moral, it's characterized by peace and harmony, and it's striving to bring humanity and science towards that perfected Geulah state. So I think I want to summarize this exciting talk and essentially say that we are transitioning now from the old Material-Causal paradigm towards the new acausal computational God's physics paradigm. We realize that the old paradigm of the Big Bang model, Material-Causal paradigm, and assumptions is no longer valid. We have to expand our gaze. And that expansion of our gaze in science and humanity more generally is that we understand that there is one reality, this universal conscious reality, that is creating, continuously creating, recreating, dissolving, and evolving the whole universe and humanity towards that perfected Geulah state. It gives us a great hope and a great sense of meaning and purpose, because we become active partners within that drama, within that progression and evolution of the universal conscious reality, especially of humanity towards that perfected state. I pointed out that there is now empirical validation of this new God's physics causal computational paradigm. I've called cosmologists, astronomers, experimental physicists, universities to communicate with me directly. Dr. Bentwich at gmail.com, drbentwich at gmail.com, and allow me and my collaborators and the universities which I will be affiliated with to carry out extensive validation of this new paradigm. It's very exciting. It's very exciting for us as scientists. It's very exciting for us as human beings. It's very exciting for humanity, because humanity is reaching now the point of starting to realize the oneness of life, the oneness of and inseparability of us from this universal conscious reality. And in a sense, it gives us great hope, because in this time of trial and tribulation that humanity and the world is passing through, if science is now acknowledging and humanity is acknowledging that the world is governed by a moral principle, that it's driven by this universal conscious reality towards a perfected Geulah state, that gives us and should give us great hope and great meaning. Thank you very much.